Thanks to its unique approach to adapting Joseph Campbell's Monomyth, its embrace of the player and its carefully constructed world, Majora's Mask is a game that's better than it by any right should be. In my Ocarina of Time video, I mentioned that I thought Majora's Mask capped off Link's heroic journey better than that game did. I feel that's a bad thing to put at the end of a nearly hour-long video without really backing it up, so here we are. In this video, I'll be going over Majora's Mask in depth, and I'll be discussing, among other things, the game's place in history, the intent of the developers, and how that intent comes through in the game. Additionally, like my opening suggested, I'll be using this video as an opportunity to fix some of my issues with my Ocarina of Time video, and doing justice to some of the material I attempted to cover there. Hi, I'm AesirAesthetics, and I suggest you grab yourself a cup of coffee before proceeding, because for the next 64 minutes, we'll be going in depth on The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask launched in the year 2000 on the N64. This was one of the final hurrahs that console would see, which explains why it didn't touch the 7 million sales number achieved by its immediate predecessor, Ocarina of Time. Picking up immediately after that game, Majora's Mask uses the same engine, many of the same assets, and stars the same Link. The development for this game was around 1 year, which was a requirement for its director, Eiichi Aonuma, to get to make it in the first place. There are some contradictory stories on how the discussion went, but essentially, Shigeru Miyamoto, industry legend and weird decision maker extraordinaire, wanted Aonuma, the dungeon director from Ocarina of Time, to remake some of that game's dungeons in a re-release that it utilized the N64's 4MB expansion pack. Aonuma wasn't thrilled with that task, reasoning internally that the dungeons he created back then were already as good as they could be, and thinking that he should instead create brand new dungeons. When he proposed this to Miyamoto, the weird decision maker extraordinaire, he got a counter-proposal. Aonuma would be allowed to make not just new dungeons but a whole new game if he could complete it in 1 year. Shigeru Miyamoto has made some weird decisions in his time, but even among those, this one is kinda baffling. Ocarina of Time was one of the best regarded video games of all time, and it released 7 years after its immediate predecessor. Of course, the entire industry was turned upside down in those 7 years with the arrival and standardization of 3D polygons, but why Miyamoto decided to greenlight a sequel right away and why he'd make Aonuma make it in 1 year is beyond my understanding. But then, I didn't produce Majora's Mask, which went on to sell over 3 million copies, so who am I to criticize? Majora's Mask was developed with the production model which Miyamoto had originally intended for Ocarina of Time, where his involvement was to be minimized, with separate parts of the game being handled by different directors. In the years since its launch, Majora's Mask has become the subject of immense theorizing and interpretations. This is the part of the video where I explain my analytical framework, but before I do, I want to touch a bit on Zelda fandom. Like all fan bases, Zelda has its cool people and its weirdos. I would definitely sort myself in the former group, but I want to make it clear that I am not a blanket Zelda fan. I think this series has had its misses, and I don't think its missteps are above criticism. Furthermore, I'm not hesitant to say that this is not my favorite series of video games, nor do I think it's the most consistent in quality. Having said that, I want to front-load my bias for this video by saying that, while Majora's Mask is not in my favorite series of games, nor is it my favorite game, I do believe it is incredibly well made, and I would go so far as to say that it's not only the best Zelda game by far, but also one of, if not the, best mass-marketed video games of all time. Up there with untouchable titles like Shadow of the Colossus, Snake Eater, and Silent Hill 2. For my analysis, I'm looking at the stated goals of the developers, whether or not they were achieved, and if they were, how so? I'm also making an effort to present the game on its own terms. That means no outsider interpretations or reframing of the developer's intent is included in this video. I will be using the Monomyth to frame my discussion of the story, but only because it's a good way to frame that discussion whilst also talking about Link's development. In researching Majora's Mask, I read and watched every developer interview I could find and came across 3 recurring goals the developers had for this game. One was to do justice to the material that got relegated to side content in Ocarina of Time. Another goal was that they wanted Majora's Mask to be a mysterious game, and finally, Nintendo wanted to continue exploring the theme of growth from Ocarina of Time. In addition to that research, I replayed Majora's Mask 3 times on my 3DS. That means that this video is actually a Majora's Mask 3D analysis, but differences are not really that significant, all things considered. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go over Majora's story. According to Miyamoto and Aonuma, the stories in Mario and Zelda games are constructed after the games. They're there to give context to the actions and rarely make great impact on the design of the actual game. The Monomyth, or hero's journey, originates from Joseph Campbell's 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. That book pulls concepts from Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Arnold von Gennep, to name a few, to deconstruct the journey of the archetypical hero of myth and folklore. The first thing to understand about the Monomyth is the Jungian archetype. Basically, we have, because of evolution, built-in schemas which we use to understand the world. Trees are good, because for millions of years our ancestors lived in them to hide from snakes. And snakes are bad, because for millions of years they were the archenemy to our ancestors. There's a lot more to understand about this, but it's not central to Majora's Mask, so I'm not going to divulge. The Monomyth is, at its core, the story of transformation and growth. It sees an ordinary man, or woman, go from their ordinary world to one they never knew before coming back forever changed. The story is usually about the hero uniting opposing concepts or phenomena, conquering the 2 warring kingdoms, bringing balance to the light and dark side of the Force, facing the shadow self and learning to integrate it without it destroying oneself. Or, like we're about to see, returning the balance to order and chaos. Those that highly regard Campbell's book will note that these 17 steps capture the Egyptian myths as comprehensively as they do the Aztec myths, the ancient Chinese myths, the African myths, and the Northern European myths. The Monomyth has been applied to every great historic mythology, and without fail it keeps cropping up. Ancient tales have a purity to them because they traveled from mouth to mouth over centuries. This means that they were filtered through dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of minds before being written down. That filtering left no place for unnecessary details, or so the proposition goes. That filtering process is why the Monomyth is so interesting, because if it was insignificant, then it ought to have been filtered out. The Monomyth is broken up into 3 parts, and when they are relevant, I'll break them down into their individual steps. The 3 parts are the departure, the initiation, and the return. When you boot up the game, the first thing you see is Majora's Mask rotating in complete darkness before the arrival of the happy mask salesman who will rotate with the mask in the dark. We then segue into sweeping camera shots that showcase the world of Termina while some upbeat music plays. After this video has been going on for a while, the music gets a bit deranged, and we see, on top of the Clock Tower, the Skull Kid and the moon. After watching this, or instead of watching this, if we'd have skipped it, we can start a new game. The opening of Majora's Mask does a good job of setting up the stakes, reintroducing the gameplay from Ocarina of Time, and giving the player a taste of the overall experience. First, we see some text that briefly goes over the events of Ocarina of Time and then elaborates on them, explaining that Link is currently searching for an invaluable friend which he got separated from at the end of his last great adventure. That's Navi, by the way. After the text fades away, we see Link sleeping on Epona, assumably lost in a forest. We also see the fairies Tattle and Tail, who startle Epona, which gets Link knocked out. This is where the Skull Kid, wearing Majora's Mask, shows up and steals Link's ocarina. When Link wakes up, we get the start of the Monomyth. The call to adventure is the first part of any great journey. It's the moment the hero is allowed or prompted into venturing from their world into one they never knew. And here, it's represented by the Skull Kid stealing the ocarina. The chase that ensues has the Skull Kid ride away on Epona and Link holding on for dear life in an attempt to catch him. After losing his grip, Link has to proceed on foot, and this is where the player is given control for a moment. In this brief tutorial, the player basically walks a straight line to the tree that sends them to Termina. We see that Link has advanced some since his ocarina days, specifically he's more acrobatic and is able to wield the Hylian shield in one hand. If a Zelda newcomer were to pick this game up, they might be somewhat underwhelmed at how much they are not taught to do, but Majora's Mask was very much designed for returning players, which is why the tutorial is gotten over with in such a hurry here. Link's newfound acrobatics are made irrelevant in the next part of the departure, the refusal of the call. According to Campbell, the refusal does not need to be a conscious decision, and it needs not be of the hero's hand. To refuse the call simply means that the hero does not immediately go out to confront destiny. After falling through the trippy Termina travel tree, Link confronts a more malicious Skull Kid. Earlier, when he stole the ocarina, he didn't seem to be anything more than a mischievous and curious boy, but as we're about to see, that's no longer the case. Link does not refuse his call to adventure outright, but is denied it by the Skull Kid, who transforms Link into a Deku Scrub before leaving Link to his own devices. In leaving, the Skull Kid is separated from the fairy Tattle. She's not very pleased about being separated from her brother, so after taking out her frustration on Link, she demands that he fixes her dilemma. The two pair up after this cutscene and go through another tutorial together. This time, however, the player is being taught to play as Deku Link. There's not much to discuss here with the exception of the Butler Sun and this spiraling hallway. The sun is probably the Deku spirit that enables Link to transform. All transformation masks seem to be imbued with the power of a dead person, and this hallway is reminiscent of the one in Ocarina's Forest Temple. I can't say to what extent it's a reused asset from that dungeon, but I can say that this guy is definitely the guy we met in Ocarina of Time. Upon entering the clock tower, the player is reunited with a happy mask salesman, but this time around, he serves as the Monomyth mentor. The mentors, or supernatural aides if you prefer, role is to aid the hero in their transition from their ordinary world to the more fantastic. Link was already an established hero at this point in that he had completely conquered Hyrule. Back then, he had the great Deku Tree to guide him, but since Termina is a different world whose challenges are of a different nature, a new mentor was necessary. And the Happy Mask Salesman is a really good one. He makes Link a deal to bring him Majora's Mask, which the Skull Kid stole from him, and, in exchange, he'll help transform Link back into a Hylian. Not having any better options, Link agrees and embarks out of the clock tower to Clocktown, which represents him crossing the first threshold. This is the point in the hero's journey where there's no turning back. It can be argued that Link falling through that trippy tree earlier was him crossing the first threshold, but this is a better representation of it, because the fall was an accident, whereas this is a choice. We see here that being turned into a Deku Scrub is not enough to break Link's spirit, and over the course of 3 days, we play as him and attempt to get the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask back. The Skull Kid has both, and is located on top of the clock tower. It will only open during the eve of the last day, which coincides with the Festival of Time, and is when the moon will collapse on Termina. Deku Link cannot reach the platform that'll give him access to the clock tower roof unless he uses the nearby Deku Flower. Only it's inhabited, so Link must purchase it for the small price of 1 moon tear. Acquiring this moon tier is relatively simple if you make the effort to talk to the people and explore the town, which makes this game echo a design decision Miyamoto made during the production of Zelda 1. When people first got their hands on it, they didn't really understand their objective, so Miyamoto thought to remove their sword and make them find it. That taught them what the game was all about: exploration. Making the player go out of their way to reach the clock tower mirrors removing Link's sword in that it places the impetus on the player to advance the adventure proactively. They must find the moon tier. To do that, they must ally themselves with the bombers, and to do that, they must help the nearby ferry. Doing this will result in the player entering every section of Clocktown at least once. It will result in them knowing how to use the Deku bubble, it will make sure they've gotten exposed to various characters in the town, and it will make sure they're familiar with the bomber's notebook, which they'll be making use of as they proceed through the game. When the final evening arrives, the clock tower opens so Link is able to confront the Skull Kid. Unfortunately, in his current sorry state, he's not up to the task of defeating the Skull Kid. The best he can do is knock the Ocarina of Time out of his hand. After picking it up, we see a cutscene of Link and Zelda parting ways, and then Link plays the Song of Time and travels back to the start of the 3 days. The next part of the story is to meet the Happy Mask Salesman again, who teaches Link the Song of Healing. After Link plays it, we see a cutscene wherein the Deku spirit leaves and Link waves it goodbye. Link now has the Deku mask, which he can use to change form at any moment. This is when the Happy Mask Salesman asks for Majora's mask, only to learn Link did not acquire it. He briefly freaks out and gives some exposition on precisely what this mask is and what it's capable of. The Happy Mask Salesman finally begs for Link to return it, which is where the cutscene ends and the final part of the departure comes: the belly of the whale. This is the part of the story where the hero is submerged in a dangerous, transformative place. Here, it's re-entering Clocktown, and by extension the rest of Termina, as Hylian Link, fully aware of the looming threat but undeterred in the fight for righteousness. The whale in the belly of the whale phrase is irrelevant, it's the swallowed part that's important, and Link is swallowed by the moon. It's going to crash, so everything he does under the pressure of having to confront the moon regularly. The moon crashing is the dark and foreboding belly from which there is seemingly no escape. Proceeding from this point on not only puts us on the next chapter of the Monomyth, but it also ends the game's tutorial. It's been pretty long, all things considered, but it's also taught us an abundance of systems and set us up for the experience. We're familiar with movement as both Hylian Link and as Deku Link. That subversion in the opening, where we only got a taste of the Link we knew before being forced to play as something more pathetic for an hour or so, went a long way in establishing the tone of the world, and being detained within Clocktown has done at least 2 things. It added to the oppressive atmosphere of the game, and it has built up exploration as something the player has earned the right to do. In this tutorial, we've also gotten the Bomber's Notebook, we've interacted with characters, we know the town layout, we're familiar with combat, and we know about the 3-day mechanic and the only way to combat it. The spine of the Zelda series is exploration, and although the world has been gated away from us up until this point, we've gotten to interact with another form of exploration, which is the exploration of the characters and the exploration of the timeline. And although Clocktown isn't the grandest area in the world, it's still a respectable N64 era hub area, and we've certainly had to explore it. We searched for the missing ferry, the 5 hidden bombers, we found a way to the clock tower, etc. In addition to all of this, we have a solid grasp of the game which supports this experience. The long-term objective is clear, but how to achieve it is not, so the player must explore for elaboration on that front. All things considered, this is a good tutorial. The Zelda series is at its core about exploration. Problems are solved by it, and indulgence in it is incentivized. Like in Ocarina of Time, the terrain for exploration here is threefold. First is the obvious exploration of the world as a physical object. Then there's the exploration of the characters in the world, and finally, as an extension to the exploration of the characters, is the exploration of the stories which play out during the 3 days. The exploration of the timeline, as I put it earlier. The world of Termina has a lot of moving parts which might take a few go-throughs for a player to memorize, but that's okay, because repetition is the natural mode of play. The characters can be used to gain hints and insights into some of Termina's phenomena, and there are enough secret areas to make going through the same area often rewarding. As stressful as the game can be, it's also very lax about what you do in it. You have a constant deadline, but it's only ever relevant when you decide to make genuine progress. If you'd rather just relax, you can just go take some photos or play some games. If you want to collect money, just roll circles around Clocktown. What I'm getting at is that Majora's Mask did not abandon the playing to win is suboptimal philosophy from Ocarina. There's a lot of content that goes completely unutilized when a player takes this experience as a race from beginning to end. You're supposed to walk around and see what the world has to offer, listen to rumors, and connect with Termina in all the ways you're able to. The developers' 1-year deadline meant that content needed to be reusable, and while this wasn't the core reason the team brought the 3-day structure into this game, the two still gel together really well. If we take a look at the experience in this game and compare it to the one in Ocarina of Time, we see something very interesting. When the two games are stripped to their Monomyth framework, we see that Ocarina of Time was stretched out over about 25 hours and looked like this. Notice how most of the game is spent in that one single part of the story. There's a lot of value and tight theming crammed into those 20-ish hours, but the mostly static nature of Hyrule makes those 20 hours enjoyable only in the moment-to-moment engagement and in the contextual interaction with the world. Seeing areas that were once full of innocence be taken over by ravenous wildlife, for example. That represents the world developing over time, and what it does for Link is have the player contrast his separate ages against one another. That game was about uniting youth and maturity, so that was a good way to frame the experience. Even so, when we compare Ocarina of Time's structure with the one in Majora's Mask, things get interesting. Take a look. The pacing of this game is a lot more focused, and there's not a single dungeon or any story segment that doesn't add to Link's journey. When you complete a dungeon here, there's a genuine change in the world. You unlock new minigames in new areas, and the cruel fates that those places had been subject to because of Majora's Mask are undone. You clean the poison from the swamp, melt the snow off the mountain, return proper temperature to the ocean, and lull the undead back to sleep. Then, in a final act of chaotic cruelty, the game asks you to return to the first of the 3 days, effectively redooming those places to suffer while you go off and look for masks and heart pieces. And, in addition to tying the feeling of actual progress to every area, in this game we also see Nintendo exercise away some of the game-stopping cutscenes. They're still around, and if we count the dialogue between two characters as a cutscene, then I'm sure there are even more of them in this game than in Ocarina, but it feels like there are fewer because the cutscenes and dialogues don't come at the expense of actually playing the game. You advance in the story by unlocking more means to interact with the world, and the interactions with the characters in the main and side quests are not as big a contrast as they were in Ocarina. In both the optional and the mandatory parts of this game, you solve problems by probing around and solving for character problems. Anju's grandmother gives the player the backstory of the world if they can stay awake to hear her. The great fairies have been broken into 15 pieces and must be reassembled. The mayor's office is in turmoil because two factions are arguing about what to do about the moon that's about to collapse, and all of these issues are solved by acquiring a mask. Now, I'm expecting at least some of you watching to not have played Majora's Mask before or to not have completed it, so let me ask you, which of those three problems do you think are part of the game's mandatory package? The fact that I'm asking obviously reveals this to be a trick question, and so it is. None of those events are mandatory for quote-unquote completing the game. Previous Zelda games used this sort of optional content to reward player exploration, but here we see a shift towards the prioritization of this sort of side content. After leaving Clocktown, the next story segment has the player enter Phase 2 of the Monomyth, the Initiation. And, as I've just discussed, this phase, along with the return phase, is repeated 5 times. Every time Link completes a dungeon, his journey is reset to this point. But, to maintain some sort of clarity, I'm not going to talk about all 5 repeats right now. Just 4 of them. The first part of the initiation phase is the Road of Trials, and it's here where the hero starts fighting their way out of the whale's belly. They usually take a proactive role in their own salvation, and their salvation is often linked to the salvation of their homes or the world at large. As I mentioned earlier, the whale in this context is the moon, and the first step Link takes after being swallowed by it is to head to Woodfall, which is the game's swamp area. In the repeats, he goes to Snowhead, the Great Bay, and Ikana Canyon, and in all 4 of these areas, Link will complete at least one major dungeon. In each of those dungeons, he can collect 15 stray fairies, and if he does, he's able to move on to the next part of the Monomyth journey, the meeting with the goddess. In this game, that step is an optional one, but recommended because completing it makes the game play better. The 15 stray fairies were once great fairies, but the Skull Kid smashed them into those 15 pieces. Usually, in this step of the Monomyth, the goddess will reward the hero with a spell, protection, or something of that nature, and from the 4 great fairies in the initiation phase, Link obtains an upgrade to the magic meter he got from the Great Fairy in Clocktown, an upgraded spin attack, a defense increase, and a new sword. All of these rewards are immensely useful, and they certainly encourage the player to explore the dungeons more thoroughly. Exploration, being that it's the heart of the Zelda series, is usually made to be a net positive, but in this game we see that trope being subverted. The next part of the Monomyth is the woman as temptress. It's named after the ubiquity of seductive women in old mythological tales, but what it really refers to is the hero's struggle to stay focused on their mission. If the hero does not stay focused, they are punished, and both the temptation to leave the designated path and the punishment for doing so exist in the game. As you've probably guessed, the temptation is simply the abundance of sidetracking the world offers. You might decide to play one minigame or help one character or fight a couple of enemies, fall in a few holes, or explore a few caves. The punishment for doing so is obviously losing time. If the player does not manage to fight temptation, they face maybe having to repeat a section of the game. The next part of the initiation is the atonement with the Father. The Father in this context simply refers to a godlike power which the hero must make their own or must obtain the approval of. Link's father in this game is the Giants. After each successful run through the 4 main dungeons, he'll come face to face with one of them, and they all promise to answer his call when the time is right. An important part of this part of the Monomyth is that the power is something that the hero does not have yet but is able to obtain later on, or is able to produce from a third party. Additionally, it's rare that this power is not necessary for the hero to succeed in their overall mission. Finally, if a hero fails their journey, then this is usually the part where they do. When they are unable to make the Father's power their own through virtuous means, they usually turn to tyrannical means, and that leads them down the dark path. But that's not really relevant to Link's development, so let's move on to the apotheosis. The apotheosis is when the hero transcends or reaches a higher place. Due to their voluntary confrontation with danger and them taking upon themselves the burden of lessening the suffering of others, the hero grows and can take on greater dangers. This transformation is obviously represented by the transformation masks. Link obtains one for every one of the 5 initiation repeats, and they are always immensely useful for combating the final boss of each area. They also elevate Link's ability to interact with the world at large after he's completed the dungeons. The initiation ends with the ultimate boon, which is where the hero is rewarded for accomplishing their goal. After each dungeon boss, Link obtains a health upgrade, which would be enough, but there's also a bow upgrade in each of the 4 main dungeons. First the bow, then the fire arrows, ice arrows, and finally light arrows. After each dungeon boss is defeated, the ill effects of Majora's influence are cleansed from the land, and Link is able to engage with the NPCs and see just how much he's relieved their suffering, which is why the refusal of the return occurs. The refusal of the return is the first part of the final phase of the Monomyth, the return. To travel back to the start of the 3 days is harder than it should be, because the massive influence Link has had on the land and the people in it is removed. In this part of the Monomyth, the hero, Link, has transformed themselves or the world, and hearing that they must go back is difficult because they are usually at the top of some hierarchy here. Our feelings about a place are influenced by our experiences in that place, and having to leave a place that's come to represent triumph is hard. Hard, but necessary. The magic flight is usually the mad dash back home, but right now it refers to time traveling back to the start of the initiation phase. Usually the hero will have brought with them a treasure or power that they'll share with their old neighbors and friends. This will improve their living standards, but here Link simply returns with the ability to progress. After finishing his business in the swamp, Link has the arrows he needs to access the mountains. After finishing his business there, he has access to the bombs he needs to access Romani Ranch, where he can acquire Epona. Epona helps Link access the Great Bay, where he gets the hookshot he needs to access Ikana Canyon. The next part of the return is the rescue from without. It refers to a point where the hero is struggling and is saved from peril by an unexpected source. If you fail to rewind time, the moon will collapse and destroy Termina. Then, the happy mask salesman is heard laughing, and you return to the start of the 3-day cycle. He is clearly the unexpected source who saves Link, and what's interesting in Nintendo having cast him in that role is that it suggests that he's very likely more powerful and more involved with the plot than he lets on. But for now, he's just the one who rescues Link from without. There's not much to be said about the crossing of the return threshold. It's just getting back to a familiar place that's safer than the one the hero just left. And in the first 4 instances of it in this game, the crossing of the return threshold simply refers to Link having come back to that first day, and then Master of the 2 Worlds is represented by Link's transformation masks. The Deku mask gives Link the ability to traverse through the air. The Goron mask gives him the absolute mastery of the ground, and the ability to walk unharmed on lava. The Zora mask makes him a master swimmer, and after finishing the Stone Tower Temple, Link is ready to take on Majora's Mask. Freedom to live usually refers to the hero's freedom to be their new selves in their old world, but it's all about the hero recognizing that they've changed and them integrating that change into their character. And After each successful dungeon go-through, Link is changed. The big difference between Hyrule and Termina is the philosophy of the developers in designing each world. Ocarina of Time is a fantasy world that was supposed to awe the player, but Majora's Mask is a fantasy world that was supposed to entice the player with mystery. Compare Link entering Hyrule Field to him entering Termina Field. The former is a colorful and vast landscape, but the latter is a bit darker and tighter. This fundamental difference is why this game cultivated a much larger theory crafting crowd than Ocarina did. There's simply a lot more to interpret in Termina than there was back in Hyrule. Additionally, much more of Majora's story is optional. These games play best when the player is doing their own thing, and because they do, making optional what Ocarina made mandatory helps the experience in Termina feel more natural. Sure, it's not as straightforward to know what to do next, but that's okay, because it's very hard to feel like you're wasting your time. There's simply not as stark a separation between spinning your wheels and advancing in this one. What the mandatory areas and the optional areas have in common is that they reward the player with the ability to more easily travel through the world. The optional parts usually just give the player a health upgrade, but in terms of Link mastering the world of Termina, that's really all they need to do. If Link is able to more thoroughly engage with the world, then the player can be sure that they've done something right. You know what? Let's go a bit more in depth on this part of the game. Alright, so if you've watched some of my other videos, you've no doubt heard me bang on about how great fantasy universes tend to have unique phenomena that enable these storytellers to have their characters express themselves or be presented in interesting ways. The unique phenomena in this game are the greatly expanded roles of the masks from Ocarina and the 3-day cycle. The 3 types of exploration are all utilized by various quests, and like I did in my Ocarina video, I'm going to go through a few quests to see how they utilize each aspect of the exploration. The exploration of the world is most literally translated into the story of the business scrubs. They all inhabit holes which Deku Link can use to launch himself to areas that'd otherwise be outside of his reach, housing a piece of heart. Each one is willing to fork over their hole in exchange for a desired item. The first one is acquired by trading the moon tier, but subsequent ones are acquired by trading the holes you've already amassed. The business scrub in Ikana Canyon wants to tan near some babes, and he'll trade Link some money in exchange for the ocean title deed. That's acquired by trading the mountain title deed to a business scrub who desires to live in the mountains. There's also a secret hideout belonging to the first business scrub, which Link can get to. If the player observes the Clock Town business scrub from the Astral Observatory, they'll notice that the scrub flies to a secret grotto. If the player follows him there, the scrub will offer Link a piece of heart and some cash in exchange for keeping it secret. The completion of this quest requires the player to travel across the entire world of Termina, and it constantly rewards them with pieces of heart. Anju's grandmother is a good example of a quest driven by the exploration of characters. Anju's grandmother is a senile old woman whose stories put its listeners to sleep. She asks questions about those stories which reward the player with a piece of heart should they answer correctly. The problem posed here is simply to stay awake, and the solution is to acquire the all-night mask, which has some causality conditions to acquire. If the player wears it and talks to her, they'll be able to hear her stories which give some lore about Termina. Like I said, she rewards the player with pieces of heart, but I think the lore really is reward enough. The quest is essentially about finding a way to overcome the challenge he poses, falling asleep, and the solution is the same as the solution in this game tends to be: get the right mask. Side note, she seems to be faking senility in order to avoid having to eat Anju's cooking. That's optional knowledge gained from reading her diary, which is another small example of character-driven exploration. Anju's and Kafei's wedding is probably the best quest that's driven by exploring stories. While much of this quest is optional, the story of Kafei's and Anju's wedding does need the player to know Sakon the Thief and when he strikes, to know about a Goron with a similar name to themselves staying in the Stockpot Inn, to know when Kafei gets his mail delivered, and to be able to find Sakon's hideout. There's much more to it, but I'm trying to keep this run-through brief. This quest rewards the player with the Couple's Mask, the Keaton Mask, and the Postman's Hat. And this quest is all about getting the timing of the characters correct and making sure you're in the right place at the right time. And speaking of being in the right place at the right time, let's briefly segue into the story about the time when Aonuma was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The production of this game coincided with the Taepodong uproar. Taepodong is a Korean word and refers to a large, watery place. In 1998, North Korea launched the Taepodong 1. This was a rocket that housed their very first satellite, the Kwangmyongsong 1. Like most things in that crazy country, the rocket failed and it never reached orbit. From briefly glimpsing some headlines, I gather that the launch might have originally been announced as a missile test, which correlates with Aonuma's wedding story. During this launch, he and others of the development team were attending a wedding in South Korea. After the initial shocks, they began talking about life under constant missile threat. This discussion served as a big influence for the moon in Majora's Mask. The wedding of Kafei and Anju came about because of this event, and the idea of living out your last days became a big inspiration when the team wrote other stories. During the Moonfall, some characters choose to stay in town, others choose to leave, and the player can influence some in one way or the other. The characters from Ocarina of Time were better than most 1998 NPCs, but still fairly two-dimensional. Here, on the other hand, a layer of depth is added to them because they are used to showcase the 3-day system and the masks. These characters have journeys that change when the player toys around with that timeline, and personalities that address the different masks differently. The characters are still here for the player's benefit, sure, but being unable to 100% rely on every character being where you want them at every moment was considered a step up in immersion back in 2000. To complete the side content, the player needs to engage with the characters, so Nintendo did a double whammy. They created engaging arcs for them to get the player to care, then they viciously tossed them aside during the eve of the final day when the moon comes crashing down. A recurring and painful reminder of why we should care about saving Termina from total destruction in the first place. And that total destruction is the dramatic irony which helps create the game's atmosphere. And the overcoming of this dramatic irony is what Aonuma meant when he said that the fierce deity is the will of all the people of Termina. They overcome their fate because although they are ultimately all tossed into the fray over and over again, they give Link masks that symbolize their wills and them having existed. By trading in all of those masks, Link will acquire the Fierce Deity mask, which lets him take on a new form, one which deals out swift justice to any boss he can face. It's very clear that the game does not think its characters are a joke or that they are disposable. Link, quite literally, monetizes his engagements with them for the achievement of an ultimate form. And that ultimate form and how it brings Link's journey to an end is something in and of itself, but to fully appreciate why that is, we're going to talk about the Monomyth as it pertains to this game one more time. In this final go-through, the player is sent back to the beginning of the initiation phase, and in this run-through, The steps I went through earlier describe significantly larger and sometimes altogether different events. The road of the trials was defeating the dungeon bosses. The meeting with the goddess was about acquiring the upgrades. Woman as the temptress was all of the distractions the player managed to steer clear of or do and prolong their journey. The atonement with the father was Link obtaining the giant's favor. The apotheosis, being a transcendence of some sort, has up until this point been presented with the player mastering the transformation masks, and here it's in reference to Link elevating to the moon where he can transform into the fierce deity, which is also the ultimate boon, after the player completes a few mini-dungeons meant to test them and reward them for collecting every mask in the game. The Fierce Deity mask is an immensely satisfying transformation that makes short work of Majora's mask's many forms. The refusal of the return occurs because the hero has achieved enlightenment or an elevation of being. They belong where they are and might be reluctant to let their adventure end. One interpretation of this is that if the player chooses not to engage Majora's mask right away, then they can rewind time and keep on playing the game until they're ready to let the adventure end. Alternatively, it might be shown in that Link does not proactively leave, but rather he does so because the happy mask salesman tells him to. The Magic Flight is the hero hurrying back to the homeland. Here, it's simply Link riding Epona back to Hyrule. The rescue from without refers to an old ally or an unexpected source saving the hero, usually at the last minute, and it's pretty obvious to me that that old ally coming to rescue Link is Epona. Typically, when the hero crosses the first threshold, it symbolized a death of the life and world they used to know. The return threshold is therefore the rebirth of the hero back into the old habitat, but now they are an elevated being. It's seen here in Link going back to Hyrule. The hero manages to complete their journey because they mastered themselves and the world around them. That's usually, but not always, what is meant by the master of the two worlds. Link has conquered Termina at the game's end. He can warp to any area he desires, and he's removed the suffering of every culture he's visited. He's also mastered himself. In the beginning, he was degraded and turned into a Deku scrub. By the end, he's transformed into the fierce deity. Transformation started out as a curse which Link had to overcome, but by the end, it's become his greatest strength. Having mastered both worlds, Link is now free to live, and that is perfectly represented by this screen. The hero, having completed his, or her, journey, returns home, forever changed, carrying the lessons and the power acquired in this journey with them. It's important to note that Ocarina of Time began in the Kokiri village and Majora's Mask begins in the Lost Woods. The Lost Woods branch out from the Kokiri village, so Link would have returned to his home after the events of Ocarina of Time before venturing out to find Navi. Link's story is therefore brought full circle twice in this game. To paraphrase what I said earlier in the video, the Monomyth is the story of how a relatively ordinary individual is taken into an extraordinary land and through their adventures and struggles in that land are transformed into an extraordinary individual who's capable of uniting or balancing opposites. In Ocarina of Time, the player was tasked to reconcile the opposing themes of youth and age to save the world. In Majora's Mask, they're forced to reconcile chaos and order. Majora's Mask is a more thematically elevated game in that sense, and in some others. Those themes that carry over from Ocarina are expanded upon to varying degrees. Link growing up is a theme that runs through this game. It's not as immediately noticeable as it was in Ocarina, but if you play these two games back to back, you'll see that it's still here. Adults don't treat him as snoodily as they did back then. Link starts out with a greater mastery of the world around him than he had when the Ocarina adventure began, and his ability to mobilize through the areas will be greatly expanded upon in this adventure. As I've already mentioned, Link masters air, ground, water, and fire movement. He acquires powers that are beyond anything he could obtain in Ocarina of Time, and he fights an enemy more dangerous than Ganondorf was. Back in Ocarina of Time, we had the hero-villain duality of Link and Ganondorf. Link explored, but Ganondorf was in the same place throughout most of the game. Link was young, Ganondorf was old. Link transformed into a man, Ganondorf transformed into the monster Ganon. These two make for good rivals, but what's lacking in Ocarina's characterization of good versus evil is significant, mechanically relevant subtext. Back then, the game was mostly hammering home the dichotomy of youth and age. Majora's Mask is a much more interesting villain than a Zelda game had up until this point, because it enables the aforementioned contrasts, and it also gives us a clear characterization of what the story is about. But it doesn't do it alone. The story is about order versus chaos. Link is characterized as the embodiment of order throughout the game in subtle but effective ways. Remember the economy from Ocarina of Time. The wallet there capped out at 500 rupees, but by the time you've amassed that wealth, it was irrelevant because there was nothing that drained your wallet fast enough for a casual collection to not be enough to make it up. The wallet in Majora's Mask, however, is constantly depleted, and once you travel back in time, you lose all of your money, except if you deposit it in the bank. The bank can hold a lot of money for Link, and it even gives him rewards for continually using their services. The most expensive item in Majora's Mask requires Link to drain the largest wallet in this game, and if you want to reach those 500 rupees, you kinda need to use the bank. There's not really a reliable way to just casually amass that sort of money in one go-through. It's not impossible, or even very hard to do it, but it's something that is likelier to occur naturally over the course of a few cycles. While the economy in Majora's Mask is barely any deeper than it was in Ocarina of Time, the way the player interacts with it is what's changed, and that's an example of one area where Link's new characterization comes from. The player is reliably going to go to the bank before returning to the dawn of the first day. It's a dependable behavior that emerges naturally from the systems the player is interacting with. It's a consistent behavior in a world that's being destroyed by chaos. I'll admit that this is not big characterization, but like with a real bank, it compounds over time. Every dungeon story shares the same structure, which again brings us to orderliness. Yes, the world is in total chaos, but because you'll go through it several times, you'll begin to make more sense of it, and you'll slowly be able to relax it back to a more natural state. But Majora's Mask is not just the opposite of Link because it brings about chaotic behavior around it, while Link brings logical, orderly behavior. It, like Ganondorf from Ocarina, also has several smaller but notable black and white contrasts against Link. Skull Kid has the Dark Fairy, Link has the Light Fairy. Link moves all around the world, but the Skull Kid is stationary in the middle of it. Link uses and masters several masks, but the Skull Kid uses and is mastered by only one mask. Link succeeds because he makes friends, Skull Kid is where he is because he lost his friends. And that last part is used to give us a sort of bittersweet ending when the Skull Kid and the giants become friends again. Also, this tree trunk with the giants, fairies, Link, and the Skull Kid together. A satisfying, if earnest and overly sincere conclusion to what I posit to be one of the greatest video games ever made. This video began with me bringing up a loose thread from my Ocarina of Time video where I said that this game caps off Link's Monomyth journey better than that game did. I don't know how many of you watching remember me bringing that up, but I'm going to quickly clarify my thoughts on this. I no longer consider Majora's Mask to be a good capping off for the Monomyth journey from Ocarina, simply because, really, that adventure did end. This is barely even a sequel to the story from that game, carrying very few characters over. You have Link, the Happy Mask Salesman, Epona, Zelda, I guess, and the Skull Kid. This game is not the end of Link's Ocarina journey, and I was wrong to have said so. But I'll still argue that this is an excellent sequel. In most cases, I think it outshines Ocarina of Time and elevates what it carried over. Majora's Mask is a darker, harder, and more ambient game. The atmosphere here is a weird mixture of hopelessness and that unmistakable early 2000s Japanese horror game uncanniness. Remember that? When games had weird localization and everything just felt off? So many things in Termina are just off. It's just about the least controversial thing in the world to say Majora's Mask is the best Zelda game. But when you dig deeper into that, you usually see the same qualifiers for that title. It's darker, it's more immersive, it's better designed. These statements are in no way delegitimate nor untrue, but it's interesting that Majora's Mask is not being appreciated outside of the context of being the sequel to Ocarina of Time or the predecessor to Wind Waker. There's not as extensive appreciation of this game on its own merit, but in a way, that's very fitting. As distant as Majora's Mask is from the rest of the Zelda games, it's still very much constrained by the same limitations. It's not a piece of postmodern art or anything, but what it is a thoroughly enjoyable adventure with a darker edge than the cartoony characters and the Nintendo logo might set you up to expect. I've done my best to try to connect the intent of the developers with what the game expresses, but quality game design is a very difficult thing to quantify. You can approximate a lot of it by learning the schemas that make the language understandable, but, and I'm saying this as a guy who programs, when you try to appropriate that knowledge to the actual programming of a game, you'll find that the skills don't really carry over. Understanding and being able to appreciate elevated media does not prepare you in any way for when you decide to make media of your own. To understand and to express are fundamentally different actions, and although they are connected, they can't really supplement or, make up for a lack in an individual's aptitude for the other. What I'm trying to say is that the team behind Majora's Mask are better video game orators than I am, and that if you haven't played the game and really want to understand what makes it so great, there's really no substitute for experiencing it yourself. Many videos and articles have been made in an attempt to clarify and capture what Zelda means, but I think looking at Majora's Mask is enough to get it. The Zelda formula is certainly being stretched here, but at its core, this is just about the most conservative and respectful entry in this entire series. I do think that the Zelda identity has in one way or another hurt every Zelda game since the first one, if only because they are designed with expectations existing that constrain the freedom of the series to grow. I say this game is a conservative Zelda entry because much of it is just refining what worked in Ocarina, and I say it's a respectful Zelda entry because it didn't just try to recapture the old magic. It leans on one of the series' often undervalued strengths, and that is its flexibility. Zelda works in 2 dimensions, 2.5 dimensions, 3 dimensions, it works as a side-scroller, as an open world, etc. Majora's Mask was working with the confines of its immediate predecessor, so there are a lot of similarities, but it takes every underdeveloped implementation from there and puts them in the spotlight. Where Ocarina of Time had a day and night system, Majora's Mask has a 3-day system that more deliberately and precisely moves the actors of its world to line up with the changes the player has made to the timeline. Where Ocarina of Time has the player running around the world to deliver a couple of masks, Majora's Mask has the player running around the world to collect masks in an attempt to more thoroughly conquer the world. In addition to beefing up these mechanics, it also streamlines many of the tropes that had gotten stale. Dungeons are still an important part of the experience, but there's a dramatic decrease across the board because you're expected to spend your time engaging with characters and exploring the world in this one. The world of Termina unlocks with the linear progression from Ocarina's Hyrule, but it plays a lot better because each area is a more complete journey in and of itself. In addition to the end fight on the moon, the heroic journey is brought to a satisfying end with every dungeon completed. Majora's Mask is a hell of a game. It took the established ground from Ocarina and, by fully realizing many of that game's failed aspirations like the day cycle, the masks and the development structure, not only evoked the latent potential of an already great game, but was able to stand out as its own thing. And I think that's why Miyamoto had Aonuma make it. He spent years putting Ocarina of Time together, and from the interviews I went over when I made my video on that game, it's very clear that while he was proud of the work he did have to compromise. I mentioned in the opening that this video was my attempt to do justice to the material I tried to cover in my Ocarina of Time video, and deliver what I wanted to back then, mainly use a Zelda game to go over the Monomyth. If I had to summarize Majora's Mask in a unique way, I'd say that much like how this video is a response to my video on Ocarina of Time, this game is Nintendo's attempt to do justice to what they were unable to in Ocarina of Time, and to build upon a great foundation an even greater castle. Majora's Mask proves that The Legend of Zelda is not about princesses or Ganon or Hyrule. It's about discovery and exploration, about overcoming obstacles and becoming a hero. The footage you've been watching was supplied by World of Longplays as played by Tsunao, BimyLee83 and RickyC. This will be the final video I make on the Zelda series for a long time, so I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to check out some of my other videos, because they just might be up your alley. If you want to subscribe to the channel, that would be cool. Also, like this video, share, follow me on Twitter for the behind the scenes shenanigans, throw in a buck on Patreon, etc. Links below in the description box. For my next video, I'm going to attempt a spiritual follow-up to my recent video on Silent Hill 2. That was a roughly 5-hour-long commentary where I went through the game with a fine-toothed comb and came out the other end with a very enthused subscriber base. I say attempt because long videos are always harder to make and there might not be enough material for an out-and-out commentary. And I say spiritual follow-up because the game I'll be analyzing is not Silent Hill 3, but rather something very interesting indeed. I'm AesirAesthetics, and if everything goes as planned, I'll see you guys next time when we play through the entirety of Metal Gear Solid.